The first time Silas Wren told them the jet was not safe to fly, the room went quiet for half a breath, the way a church goes quiet after a candle gutters out. Then Delaney Vale took the small black diagnostic unit from his hands, dropped it into a stainless steel trash can beside the service stairs, and smiled in front of her board members, her flight crew, and half the night shift mechanics, as if she had just disposed of a nuisance instead of a warning. I am not delaying a $900 million closing because a graveyard shift mechanic with a custody schedule got nervous over a homemade toy, she said. Silas did not raise his voice. He did not argue for his pride, or for his resume, or for the small daughter asleep at his sister's house across town. He only looked past her shoulder at the maintenance panel, where a little amber light continued to blink in the cold blue wash of the hangar, patient and steady as a heartbeat. No one wanted to hear. Outside, dawn had not yet reached the runways of Fort Worth Executive, and the private terminal still glowed like a rich man's aquarium under the floodlights. The jet sat fueled and polished, waiting to carry Delaney and 3 investors to Denver for a signature that would either save Vale Aeronautics or turn it into a company remembered in magazine articles with the word collapse beside her family name. Everything about that morning demanded speed. The schedule had been moved up before sunrise. Coffee had gone cold in paper cups, and men in tailored coats were already checking their watches near the boarding stairs. But machines do not care about urgency. Fuel pumps do not respect wealth. A failing controller does not become reliable because the woman in charge has built her whole life around never appearing afraid. Silas had arrived at 3:42 that morning in his old blue F-150, the one with a cracked taillight cover he kept meaning to replace and a child's purple hair tie looped around the gear shift. He came through the employee entrance carrying a steel thermos, a canvas tool roll, and the quiet exhaustion of a man who had slept in pieces for several years. At 41, he had the kind of face people forgot until they needed help. Weathered, steady, brown-eyed, with a pale scar near his jaw from an accident years back when a loose access panel had snapped free in a wind gust. He had been a propulsion systems engineer once, though no one on the executive side of Vale Aeronautics knew it, and most of the younger techs only knew that he worked nights, packed his own sandwiches, and never cursed around apprentices after his wife, Nora, died from a sudden aneurysm when their daughter was 7. Silas made every decision by asking one question first: what keeps Junie safe and fed? When the aerospace firm where he had designed diagnostic equipment closed after a private equity sale, he could have chased contract work in Seattle or Huntsville. Instead, he took a lower title at Vale because the health insurance started immediately. The night shift let him pick Junie up from school, and the company hangars were 26 minutes from their 2-bedroom rental near a railroad crossing in White Settlement. He was not ashamed of any of it. A title had never fixed a loose coupling. A corner office had never saved an engine. Work was work, and if the work was honest, Silas could lay his head down without feeling like he had sold away some part of himself that Junie might one day need. The aircraft assigned for Delaney's flight was Vale 2, though the pilots still called it the Silver Bird because of the mirrored stripe along the fuselage and the way the cabin windows threw back the sunrise when it climbed east. It was a long-range business jet with cream leather seats, a galley nicer than Silas's kitchen, and enough communications gear to make a conference room out of the sky. 3 days earlier, it had come out of a rushed service cycle on its fuel distribution system. The paperwork said the left transfer assembly had been inspected, recalibrated, and cleared in 38 hours. That number caught Silas's attention before he ever touched the aircraft. He had done similar work in his old life, and even with a full crew and a clean teardown, 38 hours belonged more to a spreadsheet than to reality. He pulled the digital log, read the sign-offs, then walked the length of the aircraft with one hand on the cool fuselage and the other holding his flashlight low. The hangar smelled of hydraulic fluid, burned coffee, tire rubber, and the faint metallic chill that gathers in big buildings before dawn. An apprentice named Theo Baines trailed him with a tablet, yawning into his sleeve, while two senior mechanics argued softly near a tool cabinet about why management had moved the departure up again. Silas said nothing until the ground pressure sequence began. The right feed stabilized cleanly. The left feed climbed, held, then dipped so quickly Theo did not catch it. Silas did. The needle fell and recovered in less than a second, a tiny stumble hidden inside a system designed to average out noise. To a supervisor watching from across the bay, it would look like nothing. To Silas, it looked like a man blinking too slowly while driving at night. He ran the sequence again and saw the same faint hesitation. Then he opened his tool roll and took out the Sparrowhawk, a palm-sized diagnostic recorder housed in matte black polymer, its corners worn silver from years of use. He had built the first version at his kitchen table after Junie went to bed, not to impress anyone but because the standard fleet software had blind spots he did not trust. The Sparrowhawk did not command, transmit, or interfere. It listened. It sat outside the aircraft's control architecture and recorded pressure behavior at a sampling rate fine enough to catch the tiny losses that corporate maintenance systems often smoothed into harmlessness. Silas clipped it to the approved inspection port on the left manifold and waited while its screen filled with a thin green trace. 1 minute passed, then 2. By the 5th minute, the unit had recorded 8 microdrops, each one shallow but shaped exactly like an aging controller, failing to regulate under variable demand. Silas rested his thumb on the edge of the device and felt a familiar sadness settle in him. Not fear, not surprise, but the loneliness of knowing something, before the room is ready to know it. He checked the timestamps twice. He checked the connection. He ran his hand along the harness and inspected the port for contamination. Nothing changed the answer. At idle, the left transfer controller was already struggling. During climb, when the system demanded more flow under shifting load, it could sag hard enough to starve the engine. Maybe not completely, maybe only for seconds, but seconds were enough to turn a rich woman's schedule into a prayer. His direct supervisor, Curtis Leake, took the news badly because Curtis took all inconvenient truths as if they had been delivered to him personally. He was a square man with a red face and a belt full of keys, the kind of manager who had once been a good mechanic and now spent most of his energy proving he belonged in rooms with people who were not. Silas showed him the trace, explained the failure pattern, and said Veil 2 should be held until the left transfer controller was opened and verified. Curtis looked at the screen, then at the hangar clock, then toward the terminal where black SUVs were beginning to arrive. "The aircraft passed primary checks," he said. Silas answered, "The primary check is averaging the dips out." Curtis rubbed his forehead as if Silas had given him a headache on purpose. "Delaney Vale is boarding in under an hour. We have investors on site, Silas. This is not the morning for experimental caution." Silas kept his voice even. "It is exactly the morning for caution." Curtis lowered the tablet and leaned closer. "You want to be the man who costs this company a deal that keeps half these people employed?" The question reached Silas in the place it was meant to reach. He thought of Junie's braces estimate in the glove compartment of his truck, the electric bill folded under a magnet on the refrigerator, the voicemail from the landlord about rent going up in September, and the parent meeting at Junie's school that afternoon where she had asked him not to wear his grease-stained jacket because a boy named Mason had been making comments. He could feel the arithmetic of fatherhood running through him, brutal and familiar. Then he looked back at the trace. "I won't sign it," he said. Word traveled through the hangar the way smoke travels under a door. By 5:10, men who had been busy 10 minutes earlier had found reasons to drift closer. Theo stopped pretending to update the work order. A veteran mechanic named Ruth Alvarez watched Silas from near the compressor with a sympathy she did not quite dare turn into support. Curtis called the operations director, Benton Crane, and when Benton arrived, he brought the atmosphere of an expensive lawsuit with him. Tall, silver-haired, smooth as wax, Benton wore a charcoal overcoat over his suit and had the pleasant voice of a man who could ruin a career without raising his pulse. He had served under Delaney's father for years and survived every restructuring, every downturn, every executive reshuffle, because he understood that companies often reward the person who keeps bad news from having consequences. He listened to Curtis, glanced at Silas, and asked to see the device. Silas held it but did not hand it over. Benton smiled. "You connected a privately built instrument to a company aircraft before a critical executive departure?" "To an approved passive inspection port," Silas said. "It records only." Benton's eyes moved to the amber light, then away from it. "The certified system shows airworthy. The certified system is missing the failure." Benton let a silence open, inviting Silas to step into it and sound emotional. Silas did not. Finally, Benton said, "This is above your level." Silas nodded once. "Fuel pressure doesn't know my level." Delaney Vale entered the hangar at 5:38, and the room rearranged itself around her before she spoke. She had that effect on people. She was 37, sharp-featured, dark-haired, elegant in a camel coat over a navy dress, moving with the clean impatience of someone who had been taught since childhood that hesitation looked like weakness. Her father, Harlan Vale, had built the company from a regional charter outfit into a national private aviation brand, and when a stroke forced him back from daily control, Delaney inherited not only his office, but every doubt that had followed her into it. Investors called her impressive to her face and risky behind closed doors. Competitors said she had inherited a kingdom and confused urgency with leadership. She had spent 3 years proving them wrong by never stopping long enough for uncertainty to catch up with her. That morning, the company's future was folded into a leather binder carried by a junior counsel walking 2 steps behind her. The Denver deal would finance a fleet expansion, settle a debt covenant, and convince the market that Vale Aeronautics was still a family empire worth trusting. She had slept 4 hours, taken 2 calls before dawn, and received a text from her father that read, "Do not let them see strain." When Benton met her near the wing and gave her his version of events, he chose his words carefully. A night shift employee, an uncertified homemade instrument, an exaggerated interpretation, a costly delay. Captain Elise Marrow, the pilot assigned to the flight, stood nearby with her jaw set and asked for a 20-minute hold to review the left fuel system. Benton replied that 20 minutes might cost the Denver slot and delay the signature meeting. Delaney looked from Benton to Elise, then to Silas, who stood in work boots beside a trash can, holding the Sparrowhawk like a small, stubborn truth. "What is your name?" Delaney asked. "Silas Wren." "And why is my aircraft still in this hangar, Mr. Wren?" He explained it without drama. Left transfer controller, micro pressure drops, primary system averaging, worsening underclimb demand. He showed her the screen and the 8 dips marked along the trace. Delaney's eyes rested on the homemade casing, the slightly uneven seam, the label Junie had once made with a silver marker, because she thought the device needed a name that sounded brave. Delaney did not see years of engineering in that casing. She saw risk to a deal, a mechanic who did not understand scale, and Benton waiting to see whether she would command the room. "Where did you certify this?" she asked. "The device is passive. It doesn't require integration certification because it does not integrate." "That was not my question." Her voice carried to the far wall. "Did you develop this through a recognized avionics program, or did you build it between oil changes and decide the rest of us should trust it?" A few men laughed because the powerful had laughed first. It was not a big sound, but it was enough to make Theo stare at the floor. Silas felt heat rise under his collar, then let it pass. Humiliation was not new to him. Grief had taught him that most pain loses interest if you stop performing for it. He said, "Ma'am, I am asking you to look at the data." Delaney stepped forward, took the Sparrowhawk by its side grip, and pulled it from the port before he could stop her. "It's still logging," he said quietly. "You may damage the connector." She dropped it into the metal bin. The clang struck the hanger like a gavel. "No line mechanic with a personal gadget is holding my company hostage," she said. Then she turned to Curtis. "Clear the aircraft." Silas was ordered to sign the airworthiness confirmation. He refused. Benton produced an operational override, citing executive urgency and certified system clearance. Curtis signed after Benton did, his hand shaking so slightly only Silas noticed. Captain Marrow held Delaney's gaze for a long moment before accepting the release documents under protest noted in her flight file. The investors boarded first, their polished shoes flashing under the stairlights. Delaney followed without looking back. Benton instructed security to suspend Silas's access pending review for procedural disruption. A guard named Lyle, who had once borrowed jumper cables from Silas in an ice storm, took his badge with visible discomfort. The jet rolled out at 6:12, its engines building from low thunder to a smooth, confident roar. From the edge of the marked safety line, Silas watched Vale 2 taxi toward the runway. Behind him, one of the senior technicians muttered that some men liked feeling important. Another said the plane would be wheels up and fine in 5 minutes. Silas did not turn. He was thinking of the left fuel curve under climb load, of the way the dips had deepened on the final run, of the Sparrowhawk lying cracked in a trash can behind him. His phone buzzed. A message from Junie. "Don't forget conference at 3. Also, I made eggs, but they were weird. Love you." He smiled despite everything, because love sometimes arrives as a badly cooked egg in a text message. Then Vale 2 lifted into the pale Texas morning, silver stripe catching the first light, and the hangar watched it climb as if its clean ascent had settled the argument. For 9 minutes, the aircraft behaved beautifully. It rose through a thin shelf of cloud, turned northwest, and settled into the kind of smooth climb that makes wealthy passengers forget the machines beneath them. In the cabin, one investor opened a laptop. Another joked that aviation drama before sunrise was a sign of a hungry company. Delaney smiled because she knew when she was being tested and had trained herself never to look relieved. Captain Marrow, in the left seat, kept one eye on engine performance. She had flown medical evacuations before corporate clients, had landed in crosswinds that made younger pilots whisper later, and she trusted discomfort more than reassurance. The fuel pressure display showed no warning, but the left engine's performance lagged by a hair against the right, not enough to trigger a procedure, enough to become a question. Her first officer, Dean Sutter, saw her attention shift and began cross-checking. "Left flow is within tolerance," he said. Elise answered, "Tolerance isn't comfort." At 11,000 feet, as power demand adjusted and the transfer controller tried to stabilize under a load it could no longer manage, the left fuel feed sagged hard. The caution light appeared, vanished, then returned. The engine stumbled, recovered, and stumbled again, a sickening shudder that traveled through the fuselage and turned the cabin silent. Coffee jumped in a white porcelain cup. A legal binder slid from a side table. Delaney's hand closed around the armrest with such force her knuckles whitened. In the cockpit, Elise declared a fuel system abnormality, reduced left thrust before the automation forced it, and initiated a return to Fort Worth. Her voice over the emergency channel was level, but on the ground, everyone who heard it understood that level voices often carry the worst news. Silas heard the call from the secondary maintenance bay, because Lyle had taken his badge, but not escorted him beyond the building yet. He had gone back for his tool roll when the operations speaker came alive. Benton was already there, speaking fast to dispatch, trying to keep the incident contained inside proper channels. "Fuel pressure caution, left side," the controller repeated. "Returning field." Curtis looked at Silas, then away. Benton saw the look and snapped, "He is suspended. Get him out." At that moment, Captain Merrow's voice came through again, clipped and controlled. "Operations, confirm whether the mechanic who raised the left transfer concern is available." The room froze. Benton reached for the radio. The duty controller, a young woman named Priya Kalan, who had been awake since midnight and had no patience left for theater, moved the handset away from him and looked at Silas. "Can you help them?" Silas stepped to the console. "Captain Merrow, this is Silas Wren. Your primary pressure display may be averaging the drops. Expect intermittent controller dropout on the left feed. Do not chase the average quantity. If crossfeed is available, bring it in manually and reduce left demand before the next sag. You may get partial recovery, but it won't hold under high load. Plan asymmetric approach unless pressure stabilizes." He spoke as if he were standing beside the aircraft instead of under a fluorescent light with his job already taken from him. He did not command. He did not dramatize. He handed over what he knew and trusted the pilot to fly. Elise acknowledged, made the adjustments, and brought Vale 2 home under emergency priority. One engine reduced, rescue vehicles waiting along the runway like red insects in the morning glare. The landing was not dramatic in the way people expect disasters to be. There was no fireball, no screaming descent, no heroic last-second miracle. There was only a controlled, heavy touchdown, a long roll, and the sight of a beautiful aircraft slowing safely, while every person watching understood how thin the margin had become. When the cabin door opened, the investors came down pale and quiet. One of them had lost a cufflink. Another kept touching his chest as if making sure his heart remained where it belonged. Delaney descended last. Her face had changed in a way no boardroom portrait could capture. The confidence was still arranged there, but underneath it something had cracked, and through that crack came the first cold air of consequence. She looked across the tarmac and saw Silas standing beyond the safety line, hands at his sides, no triumph in him at all. That was the part that unsettled her most. Had he looked smug, she could have hated him for being right. Had he shouted, she could have called him unstable. But he stood there like a man waiting for the next necessary thing, and she did not know what to do with that. Benton did. Before anyone else spoke, he turned to the airport emergency coordinator and said, "The unauthorized device attached before departure must be treated as the initiating factor." Delaney looked at him, grateful for half a second because he had provided a structure, then uneasy because the structure required her not to remember the sound of that device hitting steel. "Secure the hangar," Benton ordered. "Collect everything connected to Wren's activity. No one speaks outside incident protocol." By the time Silas walked back inside, the story of what had happened was already being built around him like a cage. Control arrived faster than truth. Security sealed the maintenance bay. Company lawyers appeared with tablets. Benton moved from person to person with calm instructions, asking for statements, collecting logs, reminding employees that federal investigators would be involved and that speculation could harm the company. The Sparrowhawk was retrieved from the trash can, its screen spider-webbed, one corner dented inward. Silas watched a legal assistant place it in a plain cardboard box instead of an evidence bag. "That needs a chain of custody label," he said. No one answered. Benton came to him with a document on a clipboard and the soft expression of a man offering mercy. "Silas, this can remain manageable. Sign a statement that your privately built device may have introduced an unknown disturbance into the monitoring circuit. We continue salary for 90 days, provide a neutral reference, and no one has to turn this into a criminal matter." Silas read the page. It was clean, careful, and false. "The Sparrowhawk is passive," he said. "It has no transmitter, no command pathway, no power interaction with the aircraft system." Benton's smile thinned. "You understand how this looks?" "Yes." You are a single father with a suspended badge and a homemade box found connected to an executive aircraft before an emergency return. Silas looked at him then, really looked, and Benton saw he had chosen the wrong fear to press. My daughter is why I don't sign lies, Silas said. Ruth Alvarez, standing near the tool cage, made a tiny sound in her throat and then stepped forward. He's right about the architecture, she said. I've seen the unit. It records only. Benton turned his head slowly. Ruth's courage flickered, but did not go out. Put that in writing, Silas said gently. Benton's eyes hardened. Ruth looked at the lawyers, at Curtis, at the floor. I will, she whispered. Delaney asked to speak with Silas in a conference room off the terminal hallway, the kind with frosted glass and a table too glossy for honest work. For the first time that morning, no one followed her in. She closed the door and remained standing, arms folded, as if sitting would concede something. Silas stood across from her holding his tool roll because he had not been allowed back to his locker. For several seconds they listened to the muffled movement outside, lawyers and executives turning fear into paperwork. The company can continue your pay during the investigation, she said, and if you cooperate, I can make sure you are not painted unfairly. Silas almost smiled, not because anything was funny, but because people with power often confused not destroying someone with kindness. What does cooperate mean? It means acknowledging the device was unauthorized. It means helping you blame the warning. Her eyes flashed. You are not in a position to accuse me. I'm not accusing you. I'm asking what you want to know. I want to know why my aircraft nearly lost an engine. Then don't start by hiding the thing that told you it would. The words sat between them, plain and heavy. Delaney looked away first toward the frosted glass where Benton's silhouette passed and paused before moving on. Silas saw it too. There are other aircraft, Ma said. If the same service vendor touched those controllers, you need to ground them until someone checks. That decision is not yours. No, he said. It's yours. That's why it matters. When security walked him through the lobby 5 minutes later, employees pretended to study phones and coffee cups. At the exit, Silas paused long enough to see Benton take the cardboard box from the legal assistant and replace it with a smaller locked case. Silas stepped into the brightening morning without his badge, without his job, and with the terrible comfort of knowing he had not imagined any of it. The first federal investigator arrived that afternoon, and she had the unhurried look of a woman who had disappointed many powerful people by reading carefully. Her name was Mara Ellison, and she had spent 22 years investigating aircraft incidents, first for the Air Force, then for the Federal Safety Board. She did not care who owned the jet, who sat on the board, or how many cameras waited beyond the gate. She cared about sequence. Machines fail in sequence. People lie in sequence too. Benton gave her a perfect packet. Maintenance logs, sign-offs, calibration records, software compliance sheets, an incident summary, and a preliminary statement suggesting possible interference from an unauthorized diagnostic device. Mara read it at a small table in the secured bay while her deputy photographed the aircraft. After 10 minutes, she asked for the device. Benton said it had been damaged and was being evaluated by company counsel. Mara looked up over the top of her glasses. Not by your counsel, it isn't. Captain Merrow then gave her statement, and the first wall of Benton's story cracked. The Sparrowhawk had been disconnected before engine start. Delaney herself had removed it. It could not have interacted with the aircraft during flight because it had not been connected during flight. More importantly, the pattern Silas described over the radio matched cockpit indications before he could have seen them from the ground. He knew what was happening, Elise said, because he had already seen it. Mara wrote that down with a blue pen. Benton watched from near the door, his expression unreadable. Delaney stood beside him and felt, with a growing unease she did not yet call guilt, that the day was moving away from the version of reality she had been prepared to manage. Silas was at home when Ruth called from a prepaid phone she said belonged to her cousin. Junie sat at the kitchen table pretending not to listen while drawing a lopsided horse in the margin of her math homework. Their apartment smelled of toast, laundry soap, and the onion soup Silas had started because cooking gave his hands something to do besides shake. Ruth told him Benton had claimed the Sparrowhawk memory was unrecoverable. Silas closed his eyes. Did he turn it over? Not yet. Federal woman is pressing. There's a backup port behind the cracked display. The memory module is sealed separate from the screen. It signs each record at capture. Ruth was quiet. You built that in? I've worked around executives before. Junie looked up when she heard that, her pencil still. Silas turned away slightly, not to hide the truth from her, but to keep his voice steady. He gave Ruth the access sequence and told her where to find the cable in his locker if it had not been sealed. After the call, Junie asked, Are they saying it was your fault? Silas sat across from her. She was 13, all knees and questions, with Nora's dark curls and a seriousness that made teachers call her mature when what they meant was that grief had visited early and left fingerprints. Some people might try, he said, but trying isn't proving. Are we going to be okay? There it was, the question beneath every question. Silas reached across the table and covered her ink-smudged hand with his. I don't know exactly what happens next, but I know what I did. I told the truth. Junie swallowed. Mom would be mad. At me? At them. Silas laughed softly then, and it hurt and helped at the same time. Yes, he said. She would. By the next morning, the sealed memory had become the center of the room. Under Mara Ellison's supervision, Silas returned to Vail Aeronautics as a technical witness, not an employee, which meant Benton could not order him out without creating a new problem in front of federal authority. He wore the same work jacket because it was the only one he owned warm enough for the hangar, and when he walked in, the mechanics looked at him with a mixture of shame, relief, and fear. Delaney was there too, standing beside company counsel, her hair pulled back tighter than before, her face pale from a night without sleep. Silas did not look for an apology. He sat at the workstation, connected a backup cable through the Sparrowhawk's cracked housing, and waited while the screen loaded. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the green trace appeared. The room leaned toward it. The recording began at 4:57:13 a.m. and ended 1 minute and 6 seconds later, exactly when Delaney had pulled it free. In that span were 8 pressure drops on the left feed line, each time-stamped, each signed by the module at the moment of capture, each preceding the flight. The final record showed signal termination at the disconnect. Mara asked Silas to explain the pattern. He did so slowly, without embellishment, his finger following the line. Here the controller recovers. Here it overcorrects. Here the recovery takes longer. By the 8th dip, it's already lagging. In climb, the demand curve exposes it. Mara asked whether the device could have caused the dips. No, Silas said. It was listening to them. Then Ruth arrived with a warehouse pull sheet she had copied before access was restricted. Her hands trembled as she gave it to Mara. The replacement controller logged on Vail 2 never left inventory, she said. The room changed again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but everyone felt it. The story was no longer about a homemade device. It was about a part that existed on paper and not in the aircraft. Once the investigators began comparing records, the fraud did not hide well. It had depended on the old, reliable protection of busy people not looking across systems at the same time. The maintenance log said a new left transfer controller had been installed. The inventory system said the new controller remained on shelf B14 in climate storage. The invoice said Vale had paid for expedited procurement at a premium rate. The component inside Vale 2, when removed and opened, had a serial plate that did not match the paperwork and internal wear consistent with years of service. Its housing had been cleaned and re-stamped. 2 solder joints were not factory work. A calibration sticker bore a code from a subcontractor facility that had closed 18 months earlier. Mara's deputy photographed everything. Delaney watched from behind the safety tape, one hand at her throat, and understood with a slow, sick clarity that what she had called decisiveness had been the very weather in which this kind of deception thrived. Benton did not appear shaken. That frightened her more than if he had. He began speaking of vendor failures, documentation gaps, legacy inventory confusion, and the need not to overinterpret one component before a full review. But Ruth, emboldened by the fact that truth had finally acquired witnesses, produced copies of 3 more inventory discrepancies. Silas added one more piece. 6 weeks earlier, he had sent a maintenance system alert about left feed irregularities on Vale 2 after a less severe pressure fluctuation during a ground cycle. The alert had been marked reviewed and resolved under Benton Crane's executive operations login. No inspection had been performed. Benton said many people used delegated credentials. Mara's pen stopped. "That," she said, "is not an answer you should repeat without counsel." Outside the hangar, news vans had begun to gather at the main gate. Harlan Vale arrived that afternoon in a black sedan with a driver and an oxygen line tucked discreetly beneath his scarf. He was 70, silver-haired, still handsome in the old ruthless way, and though the stroke had left his left hand stiff, nothing about his eyes suggested weakness. Employees straightened when he passed. Delaney met him in the board corridor, suddenly less CEO than daughter, and for a moment, she wished she were a child again, waiting outside his office with a school ribbon in her pocket. Harlan did not ask whether she was all right. He asked how contained it was. "Not very," she said. "Then contain it better." They sat in an emergency board session with Benton, counsel, insurers, and 2 directors flown in by private helicopter. Silas had not been invited. Ruth had not been invited. Captain Marrow was asked to remain available. Benton presented a polished summary blaming a maintenance vendor for substandard refurbishment documentation and proposing immediate termination of outside contracts, a public safety audit, and a statement praising Vale's quick response. It was elegant, plausible, and almost entirely evasive. Delaney listened to him speak and noticed, perhaps for the first time, the perfection of his recall. Dates, amounts, vendor names, all delivered with the smoothness of prepared theater. He had not investigated overnight. He had been ready. When Harlan asked about the mechanic, Benton said Silas Wren had a personal financial interest in magnifying the importance of his device and should not be allowed to shape the company's response. "He saved the aircraft," Delaney said before she had decided to speak. The room turned to her. Benton's expression remained mild. "He provided information after creating confusion." Captain Marrow, called in by video at Delaney's request, corrected him in a voice that could have cut wire. "No. He provided accurate failure analysis after being ignored. I landed with his warning in mind." Silence followed. Harlan looked at his daughter not with pride, but with warning. She recognized it. Do not lose control of the room. But for the first time all day, Delaney wondered whether control had been the wrong thing to want. The deeper records came from a place Benton had forgotten existed. An old backup server maintained by a half-retired data administrator named Cal Trivet, who worked 3 days a week and trusted automation about as much as he trusted gas station sushi. Ruth knew Cal because she brought him tamales every Christmas. Silas knew what to ask for because fraud in technical systems leaves shadows where reality and paperwork fail to overlap. By evening, they had 3 years of component invoices, disposal records, inventory movements, and maintenance sign-offs arranged across a conference table under Mara Ellison's authority. The pattern was ugly in its simplicity. Retired fuel system components had been removed from aircraft, logged for disposal, cleaned, repaired below factory standard, re-stamped or relabeled, and returned to service as new replacements. The company paid new part pricing. The difference moved through a consulting entity tied to Benton's brother-in-law, then through 2 more accounts whose purpose became less mysterious with every page. The software thresholds were worse. A fleet-wide calibration update 18 months earlier had raised the alert threshold for transient fuel pressure drops, reducing nuisance flags according to the memo, concealing early controller failure according to the data. The change bore Benton's approval. Delaney read the memo 3 times. She remembered signing a broader efficiency initiative that season, proud of reducing grounded hours by 12%. She had not asked what kind of warnings disappeared to create that efficiency. She had applauded the number. Now the number looked back at her like an accusation. "How many aircraft?" she asked. Mara answered, "At least 5 require immediate inspection, possibly 7, depending on shared service history." Delaney did not consult Benton. She picked up her phone and grounded every Vale aircraft in the affected group. Benton stared at her. "Do you understand what that costs?" She looked at the hangar through the glass wall, where Silas stood beside a stripped fuel assembly, his old jacket dusted with metal shavings. "I'm beginning to." At 9:20 that night, Delaney drove herself to the industrial park where Silas kept a small workshop behind a dented roll-up door. She had gotten the address from Ruth, who gave it reluctantly, and only after Delaney said she was going without Benton or counsel. Rain had started, thin and cold, ticking against the windshield and turning the sodium lights into blurred halos. Inside the shop, Silas had the Sparrowhawk open on a bench beneath a magnifying lamp. The room smelled of solder, dust, machine oil, and old coffee. A photograph of Junie was taped above the workbench beside a faded picture of Nora in a yellow sundress, laughing at something outside the frame. Delaney noticed the repaired school backpack near the door, the grocery store coupons under a magnet, the careful order of labeled drawers. It embarrassed her, not because it was poor, but because it was dignified in a way that made her morning contempt feel obscene. Silas did not appear surprised to see her. "Ms. Vale." "Delaney," she said, though she had no right to ask for the softness of a first name. He waited. Rain ran in silver lines down the small window. "I grounded the affected aircraft." "Good. I need you to inspect the rest." "No." The word was not angry. That made it harder. Delaney took a breath. "You are the only person who understands what the device saw. I am not the only person. I was the only person you were willing to ignore." She accepted that because it was true. "What would it take?" Silas set down a small screwdriver. 3 things. Ruth and every mechanic pressured to sign incomplete work gets formal protection and back pay if suspended. Any technician can place a safety hold without commercial override. All inspection data goes directly to Mara Ellison's team and the board audit committee. Not through Benton, not through you, not through any manager trying to polish it first. Delaney said, "Done." Silas studied her. "You answered too fast, because yesterday I answered too slow." They returned to the hangar before midnight. The place looked different under investigation lights, less like a temple of private wealth and more like what it had always been, a building full of machines that required humility. Word spread that Silas was back, not as a reinstated mechanic, but as the man the CEO had brought in herself. Benton arrived 10 minutes later, immaculate even at that hour, and understood immediately that the room had shifted without his permission. "This is reckless," he said. "Mr. Wren has a pending conflict of interest. Any adoption of his device enriches him." Delaney turned toward him. The device is evidence. It is also his product. Silas, already connecting an updated Sparrowhawk module to the left feed inspection port of Veil 6, did not look up. Then don't license it. Use another recorder with the same sampling rate and independent signature. The pressure won't care whose name is on the case. That quiet answer stole the force from Benton's accusation. The unit began recording. 4 minutes later, the trace showed the same irregular sag seen on Veil 2, less advanced but unmistakable. Mara ordered the controller removed. When the housing opened, the component inside bore internal markings from a retired unit listed as scrapped 22 months before. Someone near the back of the room cursed under his breath. Curtis Leake sat down hard on a rolling stool. Benton began speaking again, but the words had lost their old shelter. Refurbished parts, acceptable tolerances, legacy practices, vendor ambiguity. Then Mara held up the internal serial photograph beside the disposal record and asked whether he wished to amend his statement. Benton looked at Delaney then, and she saw the threat arrive. "The morning's departure was authorized by you," he said. "You removed Wren's instrument. You overruled the concern. Any honest account includes that." Delaney felt every person in the room waiting to see whether fear would make her useful to him. It might have, 24 hours earlier. She said, "Yes, it includes that." The board reconvened at dawn in the executive conference room, but Delaney changed the room before Harlan could. She invited Mara Ellison as an observer, Captain Marrow as a witness, Ruth Alvarez as a technical employee representative, and Silas Wren as a presenting specialist. Harlan objected. Delaney overruled him under emergency safety authority, the same authority she had misused the morning before, now turned toward daylight. Silas stood at the end of the long table wearing work boots on a carpet that probably cost more than his truck. He did not apologize for them. He laid out the sequence with the plainness of a man who trusted facts not to need decoration. The early pressure dips, the Sparrowhawk recording, the disconnection before engine start, the airborne fuel pressure sag, the serial mismatch, the inventory record, the unresolved alert from 6 weeks earlier, the software threshold change, the additional aircraft showing identical patterns. Each item had a time, a source, a witness, or a physical object attached. Benton waited until he finished, then called him disgruntled, underqualified, financially motivated, and reckless. Silas reached into a folder and placed a certificate on the table. It was from a recognized aerospace engineering assessment board dated 9 years earlier, qualifying him in integrated diagnostic system design from his previous firm's propulsion monitoring division. He had never mentioned it because no one at Vail had ever asked who he had been before he became useful in a lower way. "Credentials don't make data true," Silas said. "But since you raised the subject, there they are." Benton's mouth tightened. Harlan examined the certificate. Then Silas, with a flicker of irritation that looked almost like respect trying not to be born. Captain Marrow testified that Silas's guidance materially assisted the emergency return. Ruth testified that technicians had been pressured to sign incomplete records to meet departure demands. Curtis, red-eyed and ashamed, admitted he had signed under Benton's direction. One by one, the room's hiding places disappeared. Then Benton did the only thing left. He told the truth selectively. He said Delaney had publicly mocked Silas, discarded the recorder, rejected Captain Marrow's hold request, and authorized the aircraft's departure. He said no safety culture could blame one operations director while excusing a CEO whose pride nearly put investors into a field outside Fort Worth. It was cruel because it was accurate. Delaney sat very still. Harlan leaned back, waiting for her to defend herself in the old language. Pressure, incomplete information, reliance on senior staff, urgency, fiduciary duty. The attorneys waited for the same thing. Even Silas expected some version of it because people with that much to lose rarely step toward the fire with both hands open. Delaney stood. She did not look at Benton. She looked at Ruth, then Captain Marrow, then Silas. "Mr. Crane is telling the truth about my conduct yesterday morning," she said. "I removed the device. I insulted Mr. Wren in front of his colleagues. I valued a transaction over a warning because the warning came from someone I had already decided did not matter. That failure belongs to me." No one moved. Delaney's voice shook once, then steadied. "But my failure does not erase his fraud. It explains how fraud like his survives. It survives when leaders prefer confidence to questions. It survives when workers learn that saying no costs more than signing. It survives when a company treats safety as a department instead of a duty." Harlan's face darkened. Benton looked away first. Delaney placed her badge on the table. "The board may review my position. I will cooperate with that review. But every finding goes to regulators, insurers, employees, and clients before any decision is made about protecting my reputation. I will not purchase my future with another person's silence." It was not a speech designed to save her. That was why it did. The vote to suspend Benton pending federal investigation was unanimous, because by then even his allies could count. Financial records were referred to authorities. A full fleet grounding expanded from affected aircraft to every aircraft touched by the implicated service chain. Harlan demanded Delaney's resignation in private afterward, his voice low and furious in the corridor outside the boardroom. "You humiliated this family." Delaney looked through the glass at the hangar floor below. Silas was helping Theo position a sensor on an opened panel, teaching him with one hand on the frame and his head bent close so the boy could hear. "No," she said. "I revealed what humiliation had already built." Harlan's jaw tightened. "Your grandfather would have fired that mechanic before breakfast. Then my grandfather would have lost an aircraft by lunch." She had never spoken to him like that. It frightened her. It freed her. Over the next 11 days, Vale Aeronautics became a company stripped down to its bones. Every fuel controller was removed, verified, tested, or replaced. Every retired component was physically audited. Every software threshold was restored to manufacturer baseline and independently validated. Mechanics who had spent years signing quickly learned to sign carefully. The hangar changed by inches. Clipboards replaced rumors. Checklists slowed departures, and the phrase, "commercial urgency," disappeared from maintenance conversations as if it had become profane. Silas worked long hours but still left for Junie's school meeting, still packed her lunch, still called her from the parking lot when he would be late. Delaney noticed that he carried responsibility without performance. He never announced sacrifice. He simply kept showing up where he was needed and leaving when his daughter needed him more. Clients were not easily won back. Delaney called each one herself, not with polished reassurance, but with facts. She told them what had been found, what had failed, who had been suspended, what authority technicians would have going forward, and why Vale had grounded aircraft beyond the minimum required. Some terminated contracts anyway, some waited. 2 stayed because, as one chief counsel said, "A company that tells us the ugly part before discovery forces it out has at least begun to understand risk." The Denver investors paused the expansion deal, but did not kill it. Benton's consulting trail became a federal financial case, then a headline, then a lesson in industry panels about procurement oversight and safety culture. Curtis Leak kept his job after Silas insisted pressure should be documented before punishment was assigned. "He signed," company counsel argued. "He was squeezed," Silas answered. "Fix the squeezing, or you'll just replace the hand holding the pen." Ruth was promoted to lead inspector over fuel system compliance, a role she accepted only after Delaney agreed her authority would be written, not ceremonial. Theo stopped laughing when powerful people laughed. That was its own kind of promotion. As for Silas, Delaney first offered him a senior advisory position with generous pay and a licensing agreement for the Sparrowhawk technology. He read the offer and slid it back. Advisory means you can listen when convenient. What do you want? She asked. An independent safety systems office reporting to the board audit committee. Flight hold authority no executive can override. Open access for regulators to diagnostic data. The Sparrowhawk remains mine, licensed transparently, with terms disclosed to the board and employees. Harlan, still chair, said during the vote that boards did not create departments at the demand of mechanics. Delaney answered, "No, they create them after mechanics save the company from leaders who refuse to listen." The motion passed. The apology happened where the insult had happened because Silas asked for nothing, and Delaney had finally learned that unasked for repair sometimes matters most. The full maintenance team gathered in the hangar on a Tuesday morning under the same lights that had witnessed the clang of the Sparrowhawk hitting steel. Vale 2 stood nearby with open panels and new components installed, no longer a symbol of luxury but of mercy narrowly received. Delaney wore no camel coat, no armor of executive polish, only dark slacks, a white blouse, and the exhaustion of a person who had chosen truth long enough to discover it does not flatter anyone. On a table before her sat the original Sparrowhawk, dented and cracked, its black casing scarred where it had struck the trash can. Silas stood with Junie beside him because the ceremony had been scheduled after school at Delaney's request. Junie wore a green sweater and kept close to her father, studying every adult in the room with Nora's serious eyes. Delaney faced the crew. She did not mention investors, pressure, timing, her father, or Benton Crane. "What I threw away that morning was not a piece of equipment," she said. "It was a warning. It was work. It was the judgment of a man I had not bothered to respect because his title made it easy for me not to. I humiliated Silas Wren publicly, and I am apologizing publicly. To him, to Captain Marrow, to every technician in this hangar, and to every passenger who trusted us without knowing how carelessly I had learned to trust myself." Her voice nearly failed on the last sentence. Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "An apology is a start," he said. "Trust will be decided by what happens the next time a worker says no." Delaney accepted that, and no one in the room mistook acceptance for weakness. Silas carried the damaged Sparrowhawk to the training center himself. A glass case had been installed beside the entrance, not as a shrine to him, but as a warning against forgetting. Junie walked with him, her shoulder brushing his sleeve. "Are you mad it broke?" she asked softly. Silas looked down at the cracked screen, remembering the nights at the kitchen table. The tiny screws sorted into bottle caps. Junie asleep in the next room with a math worksheet unfinished beside her bed. "No," he said. "It did what it was built to do." "Get thrown away?" He smiled. "Make people pay attention." The card beneath the case held one sentence in plain black type. "A warning does not become wrong because the person who gives it has no high title." For a while, no one spoke. Then Ruth touched the glass with 2 fingers, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge the cost of the lesson. Captain Marrow stood near the back with her arms folded, eyes bright. Theo wiped his face quickly and pretended he had dust in it. Delaney watched Silas and Junie together and understood another thing she had missed. His dignity had never depended on recognition. That was why recognition, when it finally came, felt less like reward than correction. Later, when Vale 2 completed its first approved revenue flight under the new safety framework, 2 independent technicians signed the release. The Sparrowhawk trace cleared green, and Silas added the final authorization from an office that still held his old toolbox on a shelf. The jet climbed into clean evening light without incident. No one clapped in the hangar. They watched in silence, which was better. Months passed, and the company did not become perfect because no company does. It became more honest in measurable ways. Flights were delayed when they needed to be. Clients complained and then adjusted. Mechanics learned that a hold placed in good faith would stand even when an executive paced the terminal. Delaney remained CEO after a board review, but with limits she had proposed herself. Maintenance authority independent of operations, safety reporting protected from retaliation, and quarterly disclosures no public relations team could soften. Harlan spoke to her less for a while, then differently. Benton awaited trial and discovered that men who build their lives on leverage are often lonely when the leverage is gone. Silas did not become loud. He did not buy a new truck until the old one failed inspection twice. He did not move Junie into a mansion or start wearing suits that made him look like someone else. He paid off the braces, replaced the refrigerator that had been rattling since Nora died, and took Junie to Galveston for 3 days where they ate fried shrimp on paper plates and scattered Nora's favorite yellow flowers into the surf at sunset. On the last evening, Junie asked whether he forgave Delaney. Silas watched the waves fold over themselves, patient and endless. "I'm working on it," he said. "Do you have to?" "No." "Then why?" He thought about that. "Because anger is heavy, and I've carried heavier things than I needed to before." Junie leaned against him, and for a while they said nothing. Some lessons are too large for speeches. Some victories arrive quietly, with salt wind, a child's hand, and the knowledge that you did not let the world make you smaller than your conscience. The following spring, Vail Aeronautics held a safety symposium in the same private terminal where Delaney's investors had once waited impatiently for a flight that should never have been cleared. Executives from other aviation firms came in polished shoes and careful smiles, expecting a technical presentation and perhaps a tasteful reference to the incident. What they received was Silas Wren at a podium, uncomfortable in a gray jacket Junie had helped him choose, speaking not about heroism, but about sampling rates, authority structures, retaliation pathways, and the moral danger of smoothing out inconvenient signals. He showed no footage of the emergency landing. He named no villains beyond the ones already named in public records. He did not tell the room that he had been mocked, though everyone there knew. Instead, he held up a replacement Sparrowhawk unit and said, "The purpose of a diagnostic tool is not to make people feel safe. It is to tell the truth early enough that safety is still possible." Delaney sat in the front row and wrote that sentence down, though she knew she would not forget it. When the presentation ended, the room rose. Silas looked startled by the applause, then slightly embarrassed, as if respect were a coat someone had placed over his shoulders without asking. He found Junie near the back and smiled at her first. That was the photograph later printed in an industry magazine. Not the CEO, not the jet, not the investors, but a quiet father looking past applause toward his daughter. The caption called him the mechanic who changed a company. Junie cut it out and taped it above his workbench, beside the old picture of Nora laughing in the sun. Years from then, people would tell the story more neatly than it had happened. They would say a mechanic warned a CEO, the CEO ignored him, the plane nearly failed, and truth won. They would leave out the rain at the workshop, Ruth's trembling hands, Captain Marrow's flat voice over the emergency channel, Curtis staring at his signature as if it had turned into a bruise, Delaney sitting alone in her office after the apology with her father's text still unanswered, Silas reheating soup while wondering whether honesty would cost his daughter her home. Real stories are never as clean as the lessons people make from them. But in the hangar at Fort Worth, the lesson remained visible every day in a cracked black device behind glass. New employees stopped before it during orientation. Some read the card quickly and moved on. Others lingered. Ruth liked to watch their faces when they understood why it was there. A warning does not become wrong because the person who gives it has no high title. On busy mornings, when weather moved in and clients demanded departures and executives felt old instincts rise in their throats, someone would glance toward that case. The glance was often enough. And whenever Vale aircraft rolled toward the runway, their release carried signatures from technicians who knew their no would hold, data no manager could bury, and the final approval of Silas Wren, a widowed father who had once stood under cold hangar lights while powerful people laughed and had chosen not to shout back. He had simply kept telling the truth until the truth became louder than all of them. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is hold the line when everyone else is begging you to look away. Silas Wren, a tired night shift mechanic, widowed father, and the lowest name on the company roster, refused to sign off on a private jet he knew was unsafe. His quiet no cost him his badge and paycheck, but that same stubborn integrity saved a plane full of powerful investors and forced an entire corporation to confront the shortcuts it had normalized. Silas's story reminds us that titles don't keep people safe. Character does. Real courage isn't loud. It's the steady voice that speaks up for the truth, even when no one is listening. The conscience that values human lives over profit margins. And the humility to apologize and change when you finally see the damage pride can cause. If this lesson hit home, share a moment when you chose integrity over convenience in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story. And if you want more real-life tales that prove ordinary people can change the world, smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an upload. Your support keeps these uplifting stories in the air and this community growing stronger every day.